Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today I'm going to talk about this paper called Oxytocin-enforced norm compliance reduces xenophobic outgroup rejection. And so this paper, it was conducted in Germany, and what they mean by xenophobic outgroup rejection is basically they're talking about immigrants coming to Germany and they're concerned about xenophobia on the part of the Germans and worse treatment of the outgroup, which would be the immigrants, compared to the in-group, which would be other Germans. And what they mean by oxytocin-enforced norm compliance, basically oxytocin is a hormone that promotes pro-social behavior and cooperation. And norm compliance means just people complying with social norms. So basically what they do in this paper is they take a bunch of German volunteers and they give them oxytocin and then encourage them to view pro-migrant charity as the norm, and then they look to see, can oxytocin basically boost charity toward immigrants? And the reason that this paper matters is because it sort of exemplifies how academics think about immigration into Europe and how they regard Europeans. So this paper is actually a little bit disturbing in the sense that the authors, almost all of whom seem to be German, they appear to view Germans as just inherently owing immigrants resources, and refusal to give resources to the immigrants is viewed as immoral, xenophobic, and racist. So they treat that as some sort of problem. Okay. So to give some background, this paper was released in 2017. It was published in 2017. And that's a time when there was a lot of mass immigration into Europe. So throughout the 2010s, there were waves of immigration from the Middle East and from Africa into Europe because of various wars and famines and things like that happening in those countries. And so millions of people went into Europe during this time. And it's only natural that whenever a bunch of people from a different culture, different race, different religion, and different background all come to a new area, that a segment of the native population in that area would not want them to come and would be hostile and oppositional to that. Now, these authors, again, they treat that response as something pathological. In reality, it's just normal to not want other people to come into your land and to take your resources. So we're going to go through this paper. We'll give some of the background on the migrant crisis and how these authors perceive that and what they think the responsibility of Germans is toward the immigrants, and what they view as potential solutions for what they perceive as insufficient pro-migrant charity on the part of the Germans. Okay, so moving into the background for this paper, again, they give a little bit of overview of the migrant crisis. So they say that currently, again, this was in 2017, they were witnessing one of the largest movements of people since the end of World War II. And again, a lot of this was people from the Middle East and Africa going into Europe. So they say that since 2015, and again, remember, this is in 2017, so in only a few years, they say that there were 65 million people displaced in the Middle East and Africa. So by now, obviously, the problems continue in those regions of the world. And so now we're talking about hundreds of millions of people have been displaced. And of course, they're going to Europe mostly. Why? Because Europe has an extremely high standard of living, and the people there are extremely altruistic. They're willing to give foreigners access to, healthcare, education, housing. So, of course, all these people are better off living in Europe than they would be in their country of origin. So there's been a massive influx of immigrants into Europe. And again, this is a problem because Europeans are effectively being displaced in their own countries by this. And it's an injustice against them because they're not responsible for these problems. And yet they're forced to bear almost all the burden of this. And, you couple that with the fact that Europeans have a low fertility rate, and these people are basically being replaced. And it's an injustice and it's unfortunate. Okay, so that's why this paper matters. Okay, but the authors, rather than viewing that replacement as a problem, they view insufficient pro-migrant charity as a problem. So in other words, the Europeans are the problem because they're not welcoming enough to these immigrants. They say right here that volunteer work alone for migrants in hosting countries has reached all-time highs and is estimated to exceed 1.6 million hours per month in Germany alone. So in other words, Germans are volunteering for 1.6 million hours per month just to benefit these migrants. And again, these authors don't view that as an injustice where these Germans are basically being taken advantage of. No, they think that it's not enough, okay? The Germans are bad for not doing enough for the immigrants. And I did the math. This 1.6 million hours per month, that would be about 19 million hours per year, which is more than 2,000 years per year, just of volunteer labor directed toward immigrants on the part of Germans. All right, this is another issue because one of the reasons the fertility crisis in Europe is such a problem is that it means there's a labor deficit. So the population of European countries is aging because they're not having a lot of kids. And what that means is that as those people get older, they retire and they can't work, and they're extremely expensive to take care of, what with medical bills and things like that. So they need more laborers to support the aging population. Okay, more laborers means more taxable wealth for the government, which means more government programs related to medical care, which then helps take care of the aging population. So there's a massive labor deficit in European countries. Couple that with the fact that 1.6 million hours per month of labor is being devoted toward immigrants rather than to these Germans who need it. Again, I think it's a huge injustice, and it's a big problem. But again, these authors don't seem to really care about the Germans' plight here. They say, instead, there's an urgent need for devising strategies for helping foster the social integration of refugees into Caucasian societies. Again, I think that's a very perverted way of looking at the world. We don't owe these people anything. They have not been a net positive to these societies. Maybe we can go through some studies related to that in future videos. But it's just a disturbing outlook that these authors have because they seem to view it as like an obligation by the Germans and other Europeans to basically facilitate their own replacement in their own land with their own resources. Everything their ancestors built is being taken away from them and given to these immigrants who couldn't care less about European culture. Okay, so it's disturbing. And interestingly, the authors right after this, they go on to say that in-group preference, which just basically is what it sounds like it is, it means people identify other members of their group, their in-group. So in the context of this article, that would be like Germans recognizing other Germans as their in-group. Okay, it says that in-group preference over the out-group, which in this case would be the immigrants, somebody outside of your group. They say in-group preference is adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, and that's obvious. Groups that practice in-group preference and devote resources to other members of their in-group and not to the out-group, those groups will survive and reproduce greater than groups that don't practice in-group preference. So they acknowledge that ethnocentrism, basically, in-group preference is adaptive for that population. And then they go on to say, basically, who cares that it's adaptive? We need Europeans to give more of their stuff to the out-group and to stop practicing in-group preference. So to summarize, they basically say in-group preference is how a population survives. We need the European population to stop practicing in-group preference. And that basically means they want European civilization to die. That's the only conclusion you can take if they acknowledge both of those first two premises. So again, these authors, very disturbing in their outlook on the world. All right, so they discuss, again, what they view as the need for greater altruism among Europeans. How can we get Europeans to be even more empathetic to the outgroup? And they suggest the use of oxytocin. This OXT is what they're using to abbreviate oxytocin. They're saying that oxytocin has been shown to basically enhance generosity and empathy and altruism. And it also facilitates norm conformity. So oxytocin, it's a hormone that naturally exists in the body, but they're talking about what if you give it to them exogenously? In other words, what if you take some oxytocin that's been like isolated, and then you give it to them by via their nasal cavity. So you basically like spray it into their nose. That will increase their altruistic response and potentially outgroup orientation. And they say that it also facilitates norm conformity. In other words, if you spray oxytocin into people's nose, that boosts their oxytocin levels in their body, and that makes them more willing to abide by social norms. So what they want to do in this paper is basically say, okay, if we create a strong social norm that favors immigrants, and if we spray oxytocin into these people's nose, Germans' nose, will that make them more willing to give their resources to immigrants? And then, without getting too ahead of ourselves, that is indeed what they basically find. All right. So it's a short paper. They only do a few experiments. The first experiment that they do, they basically take a sample of German volunteers from a college, and they measure basically how xenophobic they are at baseline. So how naturally xenophobic do they tend to be? And again, xenophobia, that word has a negative connotation, but as the authors admitted, it's adaptive. Xenophobia is adaptive. In-group preference is beneficial to a population in most contexts. Okay, but they were measuring each individual participant's xenophobia index, which is what this XI means. So we don't need to really talk about how they did that. Basically, they gave them a questionnaire to assess their view toward immigrants and the outgroup. And then what they did is they took those volunteers. So you can see here it was about 76 individuals, undergraduate students. And then they gave them like a donation task where they gave all of these volunteers 50 euros, and then they exposed them to 50 case studies of people in need, 25 of whom were foreigners, the outgroup, and 25 of whom were the other Germans, the in-group. And then they basically allowed these subjects to donate one of their 50 euros to each individual in need. So they could a maximum of €1 per person in need, but anything in between 0 and €1. And any of the 50 euros that the participants didn't donate to somebody in need, they would get to keep it. Okay, so if somebody was truly selfish, they could have just taken all 50 euros and left. All right, but as we'll see, most of them donated at least some of this 50 euros to the people in need. And what they were trying to figure out in this first experiment is basically, are they more likely to donate to foreign people in need or other Germans in need? And as it says right here, we'll get to the graph in a minute, but they say, interestingly, the donations devoted to refugees, so the outgroup, were 19% higher than those to the natives. In other words, even before they do any like oxytocin treatments or norm treatments, people are naturally, in German society, we're naturally more willing to give resources to foreigners, to the outgroup, than to their kin, to the other natives. All right, so they failed to demonstrate that there even is xenophobia in German society, at least overall. Overall, German society displayed outgroup preference, which, first of all, that undermines their entire premise of this paper, which is that there's widespread German xenophobia that needs to be defeated. Okay, no, actually, apparently not at least in this sample. These people were outgroup oriented, which is itself a problem in my view, but to these authors, they ought to be happy about this, and it ought to mean they don't have a problem to even solve. But of course, that's not what they think. They don't view this as sufficient. They always want more outgroup orientation among Europeans. How can they make Europeans more willing to give their land, resources, and culture to other people? That's always the goal of academia. Okay, and there was no effect by gender, which is kind of surprising. You might expect males to be more ethnocentric than females, but they didn't see that here in this study. Okay, so the results of that first study are shown in panel A of this figure. So what's happening here is each dot is a different participant in the study, and the x-axis is showing their xenophobia index score. Okay, so this individual right here on the right-hand side, this dot, he was the most xenophobic, or this person. I don't know if it's a male or female, but this person was the most xenophobic out of everybody in the group. This person over here was the least xenophobic out of everybody in the group. All right, and then what's being shown on the y-axis is basically the difference in donations between whether they donated to a foreigner or a native of Germany. So a higher value on this y-axis means they donated more to foreigners than they did to other Germans. So this dot up here, this person, they donated very heavily to foreigners and not that much to other Germans. But this person over here, they donated almost exclusively to other Germans and not to the foreigners. Okay, so this is just showing that there's a correlation between their xenophobia index score and who they prefer to donate to. Okay, so then with panel B, they did a second experiment. And with this one, now what they do is they take a portion of participants and they spray oxytocin into their nose. And the other portion, they give a placebo. So they spray, probably just like empty water into their nose. Okay, but the participants don't know which one they got. All right? And then they measure their donations after. So the blue bars in this graph are showing people who got the placebo, and the orange bars are showing people who got oxytocin put into their nose. All right? And what you can see is that if you look at the two blue bars, so this is how much people donated to the natives, other Germans, on the left, and how much people donated to foreigners, the refugees, on the right. And again, this is without any oxytocin, so this is basically just normal people with no sort of experimental intervention. And what you can see is that they were significantly more likely to donate to the refugees than to other Germans. So again, that sort of is in alignment with the result that we described earlier in the text. But the native Germans, the Germans are naturally more willing to give resources to foreigners than they are to other Germans in need. So again, they're failing to even demonstrate that there is sufficient xenophobia in Germany. Okay? But then if you give people oxytocin, what this is showing is that it increases their willingness to give to other natives, other Germans. So that's showing the two bars on the left, going from the blue to the orange. It's an increase, which means oxytocin makes them more charitable toward other Germans. But then there's also an increase in charity toward refugees, if you look at the two bars on the right. So in other words, giving people oxytocin, that just makes them more charitable overall, all right, both toward other natives and toward refugees. Okay, in panel C, what they did is they split their sample up into the people who had a low xenophobia index, so the volunteers that were not very xenophobic, versus the volunteers who had a high xenophobia index. And then they compared their charity responses. And what they observed is that, again, the people on the low xenophobia score, they looked like they're more likely to give their donations to refugees rather than other Germans. So they seem to have an outgroup preference still, yet again, which is not surprising because they have low xenophobia, which basically is manifesting in the study as an outgroup preference rather than any sort of in-group preference. But then again, if you give them that oxytocin, so going from blue to orange, that makes them more charitable toward both other Germans and toward refugees. However, if you look at people with the high xenophobia index, so these are volunteers who ostensibly are more xenophobic. So first of all, if you compare the two blue bars to each other, the people who are very xenophobic in this sample, they're not even more willing to give donations to natives than they are to refugees. In other words, these two blue bars are not statistically different from each other. So even among the supposedly highly xenophobic members of this study, there's no actual xenophobia being detected in terms of their donations. If they were really xenophobic, you'd expect them to give nothing to the refugees and give everything to the other Germans. But they're not. They're not giving any sort of special treatment to the other Germans or to the refugees. It's statistically the same. Okay, but what you notice is looking at the blue bars to the orange bars, that's if you give them oxytocin, that doesn't actually boost their donations. They're not more willing to donate to either other Germans or to refugees if you give them oxytocin. So people who are highly xenophobic, they seem to be resistant to the altruism boosting effects of oxytocin, which is interesting. Okay, but then they did one more study. And again, like I said, this paper is pretty short, so this is the last real figure of the paper. And what they did in this last study is they once again did the placebo and the oxytocin intervention separated by people who were not very xenophobic versus people who ostensibly were very xenophobic. But then they introduced a new variable, which is basically a social norm, an experimentally depicted social norm in which pro-immigrant charity was considered normal. So in other words, they had these participants, they told them that other participants were more likely to donate to the outgroup, to the refugees, to make that seem like that was the normal thing people were doing. And whenever you give people oxytocin and tell them that the norm is to give to the outgroup, that causes the people who are highly xenophobic to indeed be more likely to give to refugees rather than to their own people. So in other words, what this last panel is showing, it's kind of the main goal of this entire paper, is that if you take people who are ostensibly very xenophobic and you give them oxytocin and you tell them that everybody else in their society is like favoring immigrants, they will also start to favor immigrants. Okay, so that's it for the paper. That's all they really find. I have to talk about some of their points they raise in their discussion because they make some misperceptions of their own results. So they say here, we provide evidence that xenophobic rejection of refugees can be reversed by coupling enhanced activity of the oxytocin system to a normative incentive for cooperation with peers. Okay, that's not true. You didn't provide evidence that that xenophobic rejection of refugees can be reversed because you didn't observe any xenophobic rejection of refugees. In this study, they found there was zero xenophobic rejection of refugees. The German people, even those with the highest xenophobia scores, were not preferentially giving resources to other Germans over refugees. There was absolutely zero refugee discrimination in this study observed. So it's a failed premise. The premise of this paper is not true, that European people are unwelcoming as a group. It should be true. Again, in-group preference is adaptive. We would want that to be true from the perspective of saving the European population, but these authors did not observe that, so they should not be making this claim. Okay. And again, they say, open and latent xenophobia continue to be a major challenge for European democracies. Again, I think there probably actually is a lot of latent xenophobia that might be starting to rise. But I think that's adaptive, as we talked about. That's beneficial to the European people if they start having in-group preference. So it's not a challenge. I would say the absence of xenophobia is the biggest challenge that European civilization faces. So these authors have it all backwards. All right, and just to show, there was one other data set that was released around the same time of this paper. You probably have seen this graphic on social media or online. Took me a while to dig it up, but there was an AINS 2018 pilot survey, which I know that this data set comes from America, not Europe, but America and Europe, their politics is often intertwined. And it shows in-group bias. Basically, they had people say their feelings of warmth toward other races and their own race. But basically, it's in-group bias. So a positive value on this graph means a strong preference for their own group. A negative value means a preference for the outgroup. And what they found is that, Black people have a very strong in-group preference. Hispanics have a strong in-group preference. Asians have a strong in-group preference. White liberals are the only group with a very strong out-group preference. Okay? White, non-liberal whites, they have a lower in-group preference than all the other groups. So if you were to combine whites, it would be basically insignificant, racially indifferent population. So again, there seems to be this idea that there is this evil scourge of white racism and in-group preference among whites, but that's not true. It would be adaptive, but it's not real. They're fighting a ghost. All of academia is fighting a ghost. All right. So again, they talk more about how, it's adaptive to have in-group preference. Yet they want Europeans to relinquish that so that the European civilization dies. Clearly, that's the goal of these authors. All right. They go on to basically say what they think we should do. So they say we need to facilitate more positive encounters between the in-group and out-group, immigrants and natives. So that way people can see the benefits of diversity and religious pluralism and cultural differentiation, which they suggest we do via influence on the media. And I think, people have gotten bombarded with the message of diversity to the point where they're all sick of it in Western societies. So again, this paper is a little bit dated since it's from 2017, but now pretty much everybody's tired of the diversity message constantly being pushed. Diversity is not a strength. It's associated with worse cooperation. It's associated with less participation in politics. We can go through that in a future video with some studies, but diversity is actually very bad for a civilization by most metrics. All right, but that's why they want it for Europe, these authors, because they want to destroy European civilization. It's the only thing you can conclude from this. Okay, so then again, they talk about how the UN is emphasizing the importance of developing neurobiologically informed strategies for reducing xenophobia. Again, that's all directed at white nations, nobody else. So then they suggest at the end, considering oxytocin-enforced normative incentives in developing future interventions or policy programs to reduce outgroup rejection may be an important step in making the principle of social inclusion a daily reality in our societies. So I hope they're not suggesting we give Europeans oxytocin as well as basically propaganda, normative propaganda about pro-immigrant behavior in order to change Europeans' behavior, because that breaches a lot of ethical boundaries, okay? But as you can tell from my tone, I'm very sick of academia's approach to immigration and how they treat European people as a resource to be exploited. And if you're a European person or from European ancestry, you have to recognize that we don't owe these people anything and that in-group preference is adaptive. And if our civilization is going to survive, we better start realizing that. Thank you for listening.